do what we needed to do to get in that passenger seat. Well, once we heard the news, we would scramble around and try to get everything ready. And my mother would relay to us important information that we needed to know, life or death, when it came to handing in homework, or getting your lunch, or making sure you turn in that permission slip, or make sure you bring your sneakers home. But for some reason, my brothers and I wouldn't hear that. We would forget that. Our main focus was to be done and ready and out the door before anyone else to get that shotgun seat. I can't help but think of that when I read our text today. The disciples seem to be so concerned about getting the shotgun seat, to getting that front seat with Jesus, that they don't even pay any attention to what he's trying to teach them. They're so bound up in their own need to be first, need to be the best, need to be ahead, that they don't hear what Jesus is saying. He's saying, if you want to ride shotgun with me, you need to know now that it's not going to be the smartest or the strongest or the best looking or the one with the most money that's going to be sitting next to me. It's going to be the one with the greatest compassion. It's going to be the one who serves. It's going to be the one who is least among you. Wow, that's a pretty hard thing to hear. That's a pretty hard thing to hear. But it does save a lot of headaches in the end. Because those things you forget my mother telling us to do, they were pretty important things. And so we usually wound up suffering in the long run because we didn't listen. There's another story that made me think about a slightly different angle. Instead of the concern with being shotgun, instead of the concern with being the one next to Jesus, the one there in the passenger seat, let alone the driver's seat. Before I was an ordained minister, most of you know that I was in the military, and I served in the Army, signed up with the Army. And I went to boot camp at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Now, when I was a kid, my dad, spent some time going hunting, and I was a Boy Scout, so I knew how to handle a .22. I mean, I did it in Boy Scout camp, and I was able to do it a little bit while we were hunting, but, it's a totally different thing to pick up an assault rifle, a military assault rifle. And I remember when my first day on the rifle range at boot camp, and in my squad, there was me, and then there were the other guys, all of which were bragging about how they were such good marksmen, and they had been shooting since they were kids. And me, I really couldn't participate in that kind of conversation because I was scared to death of holding a semi-automatic weapon. And so a little bit of a competition arose in the squad to see who was going to be the best shot. Well, I can't tell you that I was the best shot, but I did pretty good. In fact, I actually did better than some of the, quote, experts who were bragging about how good a shot they actually were. One of the things that I didn't appreciate about that experience was the fact that the instructor on the rifle range actually singled me out. He pulled me aside and he said, "Soldier, you've never fired a weapon before, have you?" And my response to that surprising intimidation was, "No, Sergeant," even though I had, sort of. He said, "I can tell, because you didn't have any bad habits. You didn't have anything you had to unlearn. You didn't have any ego to overcome like the rest of these yahoos." He said, "You were open and ready to receive what it is that I was teaching you. You were ready to hear. And so you were able to shoot well." I sometimes think the disciples, in their own way, were wrestling with their own egos, their own arrogance, their own concern about being right, that they were open and receptive to what Jesus had to offer them. So for us, the question today is, are we receptive to what Jesus has to offer us today? Or are we busy jockeying for the front seat with some attitude that we've got it all figured out? You know, Jesus, unlike James in our text today, Jesus doesn't say that ambition to be great is a bad thing. He doesn't say that. The disciples are arguing about who is the greatest, and Jesus says, don't argue about who is the greatest. In fact, I think Jesus is okay with ambition to be the greatest. I think he's okay with that. But when being the greatest means having the most money, or having the most power, or having the most fame, then you would say that we have it wrong. What he does is he says, to be great, if you want to be great, if you have that kind of ambition, then this is what it means to be great. Strive for this. To serve the poor. To serve the vulnerable. To serve the powerless. To be with those who are on the margins. Not only does he say that, he demonstrates it. He pulls out a little child and puts that child right there with him, where he's sitting, right in the midst of them. He takes this child, and according to the text, he hugs him, he holds him, or her, and says, you know, if you want to be great, you need not only to be like this child, you need to be with this child. Not just children, but that which children represent, the most vulnerable, the most manipulated, and the most discarded in our communities. So who is the most vulnerable around you? Who is the most vulnerable in this community? Are you willing to walk with them? Is this not what Jesus prepares his disciples to do when he shares his passion prediction with them? For Jesus himself is vulnerable in his passion that he is predicting will unfold. We all know that Jesus enters the world as a child. God comes to earth as a baby, vulnerable, and he leaves the earth as a child, vulnerable, hanging from a cross saying, Father, Father, why have you forsaken me? But it is here. Here is where God makes himself known to us. God makes himself known to us in vulnerability. This is where God lets us see him. This is where God encounters us most powerfully. Are we ready to let ourselves be seen the way God lets himself be seen in vulnerability? Jesus says in his prediction, it is necessary that I undergo these things. It is necessary that I become vulnerable. Why? For connection. So that I may connect with you, and God may connect with you, and you in turn may truly connect with one another. So that we can let go of who we should be in order to be who we are. When I was dating Terry, we had gone out for about a year. And sometime during that first year, I knew I loved her. I knew it. Just knew it. And I love you. And the answer came, I love you too. And I hung the phone up and the cobwebs cleared. All of a sudden, my eyes got wide, I got all excited. I said, what just happened here? I just told Terry that I love her, and she said she loved me. And I screamed, Chris, wake up! Terry just said she loved me. And Chris said, are you sure? I said, well, I think so. And so I got back and I called her back. And her roommate answered the phone. I said, I need to speak to Terry. And so she went and got Terry. And Terry came to the phone. Where are you? That should have been a clue. And I said, hi Terry, did you just say you love me? And she said, no. It wound up that this mysterious caller was my sister. She called me up to check on me, see how I was doing. But you know, as hard as that situation was, it was necessary. It was necessary for me to say, I love you first. It was necessary for me to be vulnerable. Because if I had not said that at that time, that relationship would never have grown. She never would have said, I love you too. Imagine. It is necessary for me to invest in relationships that might not work out. It is necessary for me to risk with no guarantees. It is necessary. Why? Because that is where life is found. Life is found on the edge. Life is found in the vulnerable places. Because that's where God is. That is where He's working life out of messiness and possibility. So how does this play out for us? Here. How might this play out for us this week? Well, how about, let me give you a couple of examples. How about the mother at Kroger, here at Alden Bridge? The mother at Kroger who puts her child in her SUV and straps her into the car seat, and then has that really big, gigantic, kind of monster truck-looking cart. And you see the mother straps this child in the seat and then pulls that cart and is looking for a place to put the cart. You see this, so what do? Do you keep walking into the store? Or do you go over and take that cart for that one? That's what we call a vulnerable moment. Or how about that young Hispanic woman who cleans your house? Cleans homes in your neighborhood. It's early in the morning and you're a little late for work, but you notice this young Hispanic woman in a small car is parked right in front of your house. And she's got a flat tire. And it's going to rain. What do? Do you invite her into your house? Call for a tow truck? Do you assume, well, she's got a cell phone, she'll be fine? I got to get to work. Do you go out and fix the tire for her? Again, a vulnerable moment. Jesus leads us into such moments, such times to find connection and to find life. And dare I say, find resurrection. But in order for these moments to be recognized and even acknowledged, these vulnerable moments, we must acknowledge our own vulnerability. We must recognize those moments as vulnerable, and we must be willing to embrace that vulnerability to help our brother or sister. Yet we do not always do this well. We many times avoid walking with the vulnerable for the very reason that we refuse to deal with our own vulnerability. One psychologist pointed out that there debt, by taking a credit card and going shopping. We just don't want to deal with our vulnerability. Second thing she says that we tend to do is we make our way certain. In other words, we kind of look for certainties as opposed to mystery. We don't like mystery. Mystery is uncomfortable. Mystery is a realm of possibility, and that makes us uncomfortable. And so we look for certainty. One of the ways we see this in our society is in political discourse, or actually lack of it. You're either here or you're here. There's no room for discussion in between. But that's where new life arises. But to do that, you have to acknowledge your own vulnerability. The fact that you don't have it all correct. You don't have all the answers. The last two things she mentions kind of go together. The first is we seek to perfect. Plastic surgery. We want to look perfect. We want to look an age that we're not. We want to look like the ideal. Or another example she gives is with children. Instead of dealing with our own vulnerability, we try to perfect our children. And we make them tennis pros by the time they're in fourth grade. And then finally she says, the last thing we tend to do to avoid dealing with our own vulnerability is we pretend. We pretend that everything is all right. We pretend that our life is good and everything is in control and everything is going to be peachy. Does this sound like anybody you know? Does this sound like us? But you know, here's the thing about this text. Walking with the vulnerable and serving the least frees us. It frees us to ask the hard questions about faith. It frees us to embrace the mystery because God has it under control. It frees us not to be like these disciples that are ashamed to ask Jesus questions because they're afraid that in their vulnerability, Jesus might reject them. Maybe he'll walk away. But Jesus asks them, what is wrong? What are you arguing about? What's happening in your heart? He asks us the same question because he wants to know and he wants to help. So tell me, pray and read from his word. Don't do it alone. You can do it in community. We saw what happens when you go at it alone. You're like the zebra. But even zebras in community have strength. That is what we can do. We can gather in community. In our vulnerability, we can have strength. And together we can practice gratitude and joy in the midst of difficult times. Together we can say, you are enough. And together we can make a difference. So Jesus says, if you want to be great, to be vulnerable, among the vulnerable, and feel God's presence in that moment, then come together. Gather 2 or 3 in Jesus' name. And find his strength.